In a bold move, the U.S. government has asked 27 allied countries to impose a 100% tariff on goods imported from China. This is part of Washington's broader strategy to address the economic and political challenges posed by China, while simultaneously putting pressure on the country's economy. Specifically, the main objective of this strategy is to sever Russia's energy income sources and create secondary sanctions against China to limit its influence and development on the global stage. However, this action is not as simple as the U.S. may have envisioned. While there has been agreement from the 27 countries that received the request, the big question is whether they will actually follow through with these measures. And how will China respond to such a move, especially when faced with increasing challenges from other superpowers? Will the U.S. plan succeed, or will it collapse under the pressure from its own allies? Let us know your thoughts. Comment 1 if you agree with the U.S. strategy, and 0 if you don't. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to support us. Now let's dive into this story. In the first half of 2025, the United States' tariff strategy saw a significant shift when the U.S. government decided to impose tariffs on goods from over 180 countries and regions, including close trading partners like the United Kingdom and Japan. This move is part of a broader strategy to address the persistent trade deficit that the U.S. has maintained for years, with China becoming the primary target of this tariff policy. The U.S. government began imposing tariffs on imports from over 180 countries and regions, signaling America's commitment to using tariffs as a tool to adjust the national trade balance. This move not only impacts countries with long-standing trade relationships with the U.S., but also affects developing economies, creating a significant shift in the global trade landscape. However, this has also raised concerns about the potential negative impacts on these countries, as their economic growth could be stunted by facing higher tariffs. Large nations, including traditional partners such as the UK and Japan, are not exempt from the effects of this decision. While tariffs have risen sharply for most countries, the UK and Japan are subject to lower tariffs compared to others. This reflects the importance of the long-standing trade relationships the US has maintained with these countries, and also serves as a diplomatic strategy to ease tensions between these major economies. One of the main reasons behind the decision to raise tariffs on countries importing goods into the US is to address the growing trade deficit. The US has been facing a massive trade deficit, especially with China, which has become the focal point of the tariff war. Despite efforts by the U.S. government to reduce the trade deficit over the years, the results have not met expectations. This has led to more aggressive measures, with tariffs being one of the key tools to realign the country's trade balance. In fact, China has always been a major opponent in the U.S. trade deficit issue. While China has made significant strides in its economy and has become a global superpower, the trade relationship between the U.S. and China has always been marked by intense competition. Therefore, the U.S. government has chosen China as one of the key targets in its global tariff strategy. The global tariffs will undoubtedly have a significant impact on the economies of the U.S. and other countries. First, U.S. consumers will be the first to bear the brunt of this impact as the prices of goods rise due to tariffs. While the tariffs will help protect domestic industries, they may also drive up the prices of consumer goods, directly affecting the everyday lives of Americans. Moreover, countries affected by U.S. tariffs will likely retaliate, leading to a global trade war. As these countries impose tariffs on U.S. goods, American exports will face challenges, and businesses will have to navigate the risks from global market volatility. This not only impacts manufacturing industries, but also leads to changes in global supply chains. From the tariff situation in the first half of 2025, several important lessons can be drawn for countries, businesses, and consumers. First, countries must focus on enhancing their competitiveness in the global economy. While relying on exports and maintaining long-term trade relationships is crucial, nations must also be prepared to respond to sudden changes in international trade policies. Second, for businesses, diversifying markets and supply chains will help minimize the risks of tariff fluctuations. Companies must adopt flexible strategies and be ready to adapt to changes in the trade environment to ensure long-term sustainable growth. Lastly, consumers need to be more aware of the effects of tariff strategies on the prices of goods. Although they cannot change government policies, they can proactively adjust their consumption habits and seek alternative products to reduce costs. Furthermore, consumers can voice their opinions through political channels to influence important tariff-related decisions. While tariffs are an important strategy to adjust the economy, no one can predict their exact future. The U.S. government will continue to pursue this strategy amid growing trade deficits and global competition. However, it is essential for all nations to take a long-term view and continually seek creative solutions to ensure a stable and sustainable global trade environment. In the meantime, the trade relations between countries will continue to face challenges, from dealing with tariffs to resolving issues related to cooperation and competition. Smart and flexible policy decisions will help nations and businesses maintain competitive positions in an increasingly interconnected and rapidly changing world. In 2025, the United States implemented a series of aggressive tariff measures against China. Notably, February marked the first round of increases, with a 10% tariff imposed on goods imported from China. However, just 1 month later, in March, the U.S. government raised the tariff by another 10%, bringing the total tariff rate to 20%. By April, the tariff on Chinese goods reached a staggering 145%, marking a powerful strike against China's economy. While the tariff policy of the United States aims to reduce the trade deficit and pressure China, it has also caused significant effects on American consumers. The increase in tariffs has made goods imported from China more expensive, directly impacting the wallets of consumers. A clear example of this is the price increase of popular consumer products. The price of the Tesla Model 3, one of the most popular cars in the U.S., rose by $12,000 due to the higher production costs stemming from the new tariffs. Other consumer products, such as Lego sets, also saw a significant price hike, with an increase of up to $50 per set. This not only affected consumers, but also triggered public outcry in the community. Although trade tensions between the U.S. and China escalated throughout the first few months of 2025, a positive development emerged at the end of April. Negotiations between the two countries led to an agreement that resulted in the cancellation of 91% of the additional tariffs that had been imposed. This helped ease the pressure on businesses and consumers, while also opening up a new channel for addressing trade disputes in the future. From the new tariffs against China, a key lesson can be drawn. Trade wars may offer short-term benefits to a nation's economy by protecting domestic industries, but they also carry negative consequences for consumers and the global economy. Imposing heavy tariffs can cause price increases, forcing consumers to pay higher prices for everyday products. On the other hand, the negotiations and the agreement to cancel additional tariffs also underscore the importance of maintaining dialogue channels in international trade. A flexible strategy and negotiation can help mitigate negative impacts and achieve agreements that benefit all parties involved. Therefore, the main lesson is the need for careful consideration between protecting domestic interests and maintaining cooperative and sustainable trade relationships with international partners. Part 4. Reasons behind the U.S. imposing global tariffs. Amid the global economic challenges, the United States has decided to impose global tariffs as a way to address domestic economic issues and stabilize its national economy. Although this tariff policy has sparked considerable controversy and impacted international trade relations, it reflects the urgency of the U.S. in protecting its economy and promoting sustainable development. Here are some of the key reasons behind the U.S. decision to implement global tariffs in recent times. One of the biggest reasons behind the decision to implement global tariffs is the adjustment in global economic growth forecasts. In the latest reports, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, has lowered its global economic growth projections, indicating a less than optimistic outlook for the world economy. This decline in growth is raising major concerns in the U.S., as the American economy might struggle to maintain sustainable growth. In particular, signs of economic recession have become increasingly evident, with many key economic indicators showing weakness. Experts are worried that the U.S. could fall into a recession without timely countermeasures. As a result, the U.S. government has decided to impose tariffs as a critical tool to cope with this situation and stimulate the economy. Another factor contributing to concerns about the U.S. economy is the weak labor market. While the U.S. economy has created a certain number of jobs in recent times, wage growth and unemployment rates have not met expectations. Recent indicators show that wage growth is much lower than expected, suggesting that workers are still struggling to maintain stable incomes. The lack of wage growth is also a worrying sign for consumer purchasing power, which is one of the main drivers of the economy. When people cannot afford to spend on goods and services, economic recovery becomes much more difficult. Therefore, the U.S. government is using tariffs as a tool to stimulate domestic production and create more jobs, thus improving labor conditions and income for its citizens. Tariffs are seen as an effective tool to alleviate financial pressure on the U.S. economy amid the potential risk of recession. Rather than relying on large financial stimulus packages or increased public spending, tariffs can help mitigate the decline in production and consumption sectors. By taxing imported goods, the U.S. government hopes to create an incentive for domestic companies to ramp up production, reducing reliance on supplies from other countries. While tariffs may lead to higher prices for consumer goods, they also provide domestic businesses with an opportunity to compete better with imported goods. This could lead to more job opportunities in manufacturing, construction, and related sectors, helping maintain long-term stability in the domestic economy. The implementation of global tariffs does not only impact the U.S. economy, but also causes significant disruptions in partner countries. Major exporting nations such as China, Mexico, and Canada will face declines in exports to the U.S., which could make it difficult for these countries to maintain growth rates. However, countries whose economies depend heavily on exports will have to adapt to the changes in global trade policies. Furthermore, the U.S. imposition of tariffs on goods from other countries will escalate tensions in international trade relations, particularly between economic superpowers. This could lead to a tariff war, where nations retaliate by imposing tariffs on U.S. goods. If this situation continues, it could severely impact global economic development, as supply chains are disrupted and trade costs rise. From the U.S.'s decision to implement global tariffs, several important lessons can be drawn for countries and businesses. First, the use of tariffs must be carried out with caution, as while it can help protect domestic production, it can also negatively affect consumers and domestic businesses. Therefore, countries need to find a balance between protecting domestic industries and maintaining stable international trade relations. Second, countries must have long-term strategies for economic development, especially in the context of strong globalization. Relying too much on one tool like tariffs can lead to unforeseen consequences in the future. Therefore, countries need to explore creative solutions to maintain stability and achieve sustainable growth. Lastly, the key lesson is the importance of maintaining flexibility in economic policies. In a rapidly changing world, countries and businesses must always be ready to adjust their strategies to tackle new challenges and seize growth opportunities. The U.S.'s global tariff policy in 2025 reflects the urgency of protecting the national economy and maintaining stability amid the potential economic recession. While tariffs are a powerful tool, they must be used carefully to avoid negative impacts on partner countries and the global economy. More than ever, flexibility and long-term strategies will be crucial for countries to overcome difficulties and continue to develop in an increasingly interconnected and changing world. Comment 1 if you agree with this policy, and 0 if you don't. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to support us. Now let's continue following the latest developments. Amid the global economic challenges, the United States has decided to impose global tariffs as a way to address domestic economic issues and stabilize its national economy. Although this tariff policy has sparked considerable controversy and impacted international trade relations, it reflects the urgency of the U.S. in protecting its economy and promoting sustainable development. Here are some of the key reasons behind the U.S. decision to implement global tariffs in recent times. One of the biggest reasons behind the decision to implement global tariffs is the adjustment in global economic growth forecasts. In the latest reports, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, has lowered its global economic growth projections, indicating a less than optimistic outlook for the world economy. This decline in growth is raising major concerns in the U.S., as the American economy might struggle to maintain sustainable growth. In particular, signs of economic recession have become increasingly evident, with many key economic indicators showing weakness. Experts are worried that the U.S. could fall into a recession without timely countermeasures. As a result, the U.S. government has decided to impose tariffs as a critical tool to cope with this situation and stimulate the economy. Another factor contributing to concerns about the U.S. economy is the weak labor market. While the U.S. economy has created a certain number of jobs in recent times, wage growth and unemployment rates have not met expectations. Recent indicators show that wage growth is much lower than expected, suggesting that workers are still struggling to maintain stable incomes. The lack of wage growth is also a worrying sign for consumer purchasing power, which is one of the main drivers of the economy. When people cannot afford to spend on goods and services, economic recovery becomes much more difficult. Therefore, the U.S. government is using tariffs as a tool to stimulate domestic production and create more jobs, thus improving labor conditions and income for its citizens. Tariffs are seen as an effective tool to alleviate financial pressure on the U.S. economy amid the potential risk of recession. Rather than relying on large financial stimulus packages or increased public spending, tariffs can help mitigate the decline in production and consumption sectors. By taxing imported goods, the U.S. government hopes to create an incentive for domestic companies to ramp up production, reducing reliance on supplies from other countries. While tariffs may lead to higher prices for consumer goods, they also provide domestic businesses with an opportunity to compete better with imported goods. This could lead to more job opportunities in manufacturing, construction, and related sectors, helping maintain long-term stability in the domestic economy. The implementation of global tariffs does not only impact the U.S. economy, but also causes significant disruptions in partner countries. Major exporting nations such as China, Mexico, and Canada will face declines in exports to the U.S., which could make it difficult for these countries to maintain growth rates. However, countries whose economies depend heavily on exports will have to adapt to the changes in global trade policies. Furthermore, the U.S. imposition of tariffs on goods from other countries will escalate tensions in international trade relations, particularly between economic superpowers. This could lead to a tariff war, where nations retaliate by imposing tariffs on U.S. goods. If this situation continues, it could severely impact global economic development, as supply chains are disrupted and trade costs rise. From the U.S.'s decision to implement global tariffs, several important lessons can be drawn for countries and businesses. First, the use of tariffs must be carried out with caution, as while it can help protect domestic production, it can also negatively affect consumers and domestic businesses. Therefore, countries need to find a balance between protecting domestic industries and maintaining stable international trade relations. Second, countries must have long-term strategies for economic development, especially in the context of strong globalization. Relying too much on one tool like tariffs can lead to unforeseen consequences in the future. Therefore, countries need to explore creative solutions to maintain stability and achieve sustainable growth. Lastly, the key lesson is the importance of maintaining flexibility in economic policies. In a rapidly changing world, countries and businesses must always be ready to adjust their strategies to tackle new challenges and seize growth opportunities. The U.S.'s global tariff policy in 2025 reflects the urgency of protecting the national economy and maintaining stability amid the potential economic recession. While tariffs are a powerful tool, they must be used carefully to avoid negative impacts on partner countries and the global economy. More than ever, flexibility and long-term strategies will be crucial for countries to overcome difficulties and continue to develop in an increasingly interconnected and changing world. Comment 1 if you agree with this policy, and 0 if you don't. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to support us. Now let's continue following the latest developments. In mid-2025, U.S. President Donald Trump held a private meeting with senior officials from European countries, during which he called for a 100% tariff on goods imported from China. This move not only sparked widespread debate, but also reflected a bold strategy in international trade relations, with a clear goal: to cut off Russia's war funding and curb China's rise on the global stage. During this meeting, the Trump administration urged 27 EU countries to impose a 100% tariff on Chinese imports. This aggressive step demonstrated the US's determination to use tariffs as a lever not only to pressure China, but also to involve its strategic allies in this confrontation. This move marked a significant escalation in the US-China trade war, with tariffs previously ranging from 10% to 25%. A 100% tariff would have far-reaching consequences for China's economy, especially in key industries like technology, automobiles, and consumer goods. On the other hand, this tariff would also create challenges for US and European companies with strong business ties to China, as production costs and the price of goods would rise substantially. So why did the US government push for such a strong move? The primary reason lies in its strategic goals: to cut off Russia's funding for its war efforts while simultaneously containing China in the global race for economic and military power. With Russia continuing its unstable military and political activities, particularly in the war in Ukraine, the US has decided to employ a double attack strategy. By asking European countries to impose high tariffs on Chinese goods, the US aims to damage China's economy while indirectly impacting Russia, as many industrial products, energy, and technology from China remain key supplies for Russia's war effort. Furthermore, the US seeks to reduce its dependence on countries with rapidly rising economic and military power like China. This tariff move is part of the US's long-term strategy to prevent China from gaining more influence in technology, trade, and military sectors, thus safeguarding its own global position. One notable aspect of the US decision is the selection of the EU as an important partner in this tariff strategy. The EU has strong trade ties with China, and many countries within the European Union have significant trade agreements and supply chains with China. When European countries align to impose high tariffs on Chinese goods, the impact would be much more significant than if the US acted alone. The EU is not only a major market, but also an indispensable economic partner for China. The imposition of heavy tariffs by the EU would reduce China's export capacity to these nations, further exerting pressure on an already strained Chinese economy, which is struggling under Western sanctions. By leveraging this relationship, the US not only increases tensions with China, but also creates an opportunity to foster strategic coordination between major Western economies. This could be a preparatory step for further measures aimed at pressuring other countries that do not adhere to international trade rules, particularly China. If the EU countries actually follow through with the US request, the impact of this tariff will not be limited to just the US and China, but will spread globally. Countries dependent on exports to major markets like the US and the EU will face difficulties, particularly those in Asia and some developing countries. Global supply chains will be severely disrupted as the cost of imported goods rises, directly affecting consumer prices. Moreover, if this tariff war continues, it could lead to a global economic crisis, especially as countries begin imposing retaliatory measures. The breakdown of global supply chains will affect industries not only in the US and China, but also worldwide, from automobile production to technology and agriculture. The 100% tariff on China and the EU's involvement in this strategy demonstrate that in a globalized world, trade decisions not only affect countries with direct trade relations, but also have a profound impact on the global economy. While strong tariff policies can be an effective tool in achieving strategic objectives, they also carry risks for the global economy, particularly when countries disagree and retaliate. In this context, countries need to exercise caution when making decisions related to tariffs and international trade policies. The question remains, will EU countries unanimously carry out the US's request? And will this strategy truly achieve the goals set by the Trump administration? Meanwhile, other countries will have to find ways to adjust their strategies to protect national interests and avoid being dragged into this escalating trade war. The US request for EU countries to impose a 100% tariff on goods from China has sparked strong reactions within the European Union. While the objective of this policy is to pressure China on trade and political issues, not all EU countries agree with the US's demand. Countries with strong economic ties to China, such as Germany, France, and Italy, have expressed concerns and have not fully supported this decision. Additionally, Eastern European countries are worried about the impact of severing supply chains from China on their production and economic growth. The European Union, EU, has always maintained close trade relations with China, and imposing a 100% tariff on Chinese goods would significantly impact the economies of EU member states. Countries such as Germany, France, and Italy, which have large trade agreements with China, have voiced strong opposition to the US's request. They are concerned that such high tariffs would not only disrupt trade relations, but could also harm domestic industries, especially those dependent on supplies of raw materials and components from China. Germany, the largest economy in the EU and one of the countries with the closest trade relations with China, has expressed concerns about the impact of tariffs on the automobile and technology sectors, two key areas of the German economy. Germany is one of the world's largest exporters, and imposing high tariffs on China could cause German companies to face higher production costs and reduced profits. France has also not fully agreed with the US on this issue, arguing that tariffs are not the optimal solution for addressing China's trade and political issues. French leaders are worried that this policy could negatively impact the global economy and exacerbate international tensions. Italy, with a strong manufacturing and export industry, is also at risk of facing losses if this tariff policy is enforced, particularly in industries such as fashion, automobiles, and food. While Western European countries are concerned about the tariff's impact on trade relations with China, Eastern European countries are more focused on the direct impact on supply chains. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, which rely heavily on imports from China, have voiced concerns about the disruption of these supply chains. They argue that while the goal of the tariff is to reduce dependence on China, a 100% tariff could disrupt the supply of critical components, raw materials, and consumer products, affecting domestic production and economic growth. For these countries, replacing Chinese supply sources is not easy. China remains one of the largest trade partners for many Eastern European nations, and changing supply chains could incur higher costs and extended transition periods. A critical factor the EU faces is the need to maintain independence in its international trade policies. The European Union has repeatedly stated that it does not want to blindly follow the US's strategies in the trade war. While the US is using tariffs as a strategic tool to pressure other countries, the EU does not want to become a pawn in a trade conflict that does not bring real benefits to its member states. EU leaders emphasize that indiscriminate tariffs could harm European economies and drag the EU into a trade war it does not want to participate in. Instead, the EU prioritizes seeking international cooperation solutions and resolving disputes through negotiations and international mechanisms rather than using tariffs. The US's request for the EU to impose a 100% tariff on China could increase tensions in the relationship between the US and EU countries. EU members may feel that the US is pressuring them to join a strategy they do not fully support, leading to potential divisions within the Western alliance. If the EU does not align with the US in the tariff strategy against China, there could be backlash from the US government, which may affect trade relations between the US and EU countries. On the other hand, if the EU agrees to the US's request, it could result in significant changes in the relationship between the EU and China, while disrupting global supply chains. This debate over the 100% tariff on China highlights an important point. In a globalized world, there is no simple solution to international trade and political issues. While tariffs can be a powerful tool, they also carry significant risks, particularly when countries do not agree. The EU must find a way to protect its economic interests while maintaining strategic relations with both the US and China. Meanwhile, Eastern European countries must find solutions to ensure their supply chains are not disrupted and that their economic development is not harmed. Amid growing global tensions and increasing trade conflicts, the relationship between major nations like India and the United States has become more complex than ever. One of the most prominent issues is India's increased import of oil from Russia, which not only helps Russia evade international sanctions, but also places India in a difficult position facing strong criticism from the US. Additionally, the relationship between the US and China is a critical factor, as America continues to grapple with its deep dependence on Chinese imports. This issue is not only impacting the U.S. economy, but also complicates the maintenance of global trade strategies. In recent years, India has significantly increased its oil imports from Russia as part of its strategy to maintain a stable energy supply for its rapidly growing economy. This decision was not made lightly by India, especially in the context of Western nations, including the US and the European Union, applying strong sanctions on Russia due to the war in Ukraine. Despite Western sanctions aiming to isolate Russia from the global economy, India has seized the opportunity to strengthen its trade relations with Russia, particularly in the energy sector. By purchasing cheap oil from Russia, India has been able to save on energy costs, which benefits the third largest economy in the world, especially as global oil prices rise. However, this move has not been well received by the US, which has urged countries to reduce their reliance on Russian oil. Donald Trump, in a strong move, decided to impose a 25% tariff on goods imported from India to protest India's continued purchase of oil from Russia, despite US sanctions on Moscow. This was part of Trump's strategy to apply pressure on countries that were not complying with US policies in the fight against Russia. Imposing a 25% tariff on Indian goods not only escalated tensions between the two nations, but also highlighted the complexities of international relations. India finds itself caught between two opposing strategies: maintaining a long-standing relationship with Russia in energy and trying to develop relations with the US and Western nations. This dilemma not only impacts India's economy, but could also create significant challenges for US foreign policy strategies. One of the major challenges the US faces in the global trade war is its deep dependence on goods from China. Although the US has implemented tariffs on Chinese goods to reduce its trade deficit and protect domestic industries, the reality is that the US currently depends on 198 categories of goods from China. This is a staggering number, and severing trade with China would not be a simple decision. Products from China, including electronic components, pharmaceuticals, and other critical materials, make up a significant portion of global supply chains. If the US decided to sever all trade ties with China, it would lead to a supply crisis, with prices of essential goods, especially in technology, healthcare, and consumer sectors, rising sharply. US businesses would struggle to replace Chinese products with other suppliers, and production costs would increase dramatically. This places US leaders in a difficult position. On one hand, they want to reduce dependence on China to protect the domestic economy, but on the other hand, they cannot easily replace Chinese supplies in the short term without causing major damage to the economy and consumers. Although the US government has made strong efforts to replace some Chinese supplies with other partners like Vietnam, Mexico, and Southeast Asian nations, replacing nearly 200 types of goods is not easy and will take significant time. India's continued import of oil from Russia and the US's ongoing dependence on China illustrate the complexity and contradictions in global trade policy. Nations must balance protecting their national interests with maintaining trade relations with key partners. While the US and the West seek to reduce dependence on countries that do not comply with international norms, countries like India seek to maintain economic ties with partners they need, despite external criticism and pressure. This situation also highlights the difficulty of maintaining trade strategies in a globalized world, where countries cannot completely sever economic ties with major partners like China and Russia. Tariff policies and sanctions may work in the short term, but in the long run, they will need to be adjusted to avoid causing negative effects on the global economy. The relationship between the US, India, and China reflects an important lesson about dependence in the global economy. Countries cannot easily change global supply chains without facing serious consequences for their economy and domestic businesses. Therefore, countries need long-term strategies to reduce dependence on other nations while maintaining a cooperative and stable trade environment. In the future, countries will need to find a balance between economic and political interests when dealing with major partners like China and Russia. Building flexible trade strategies, diversifying supply chains, and maintaining stable economic relationships will be key to sustaining development in an ever-changing world. The trade war between the US and China continues to attract global attention, especially with the US urging 27 EU countries to impose a 100% tariff on goods imported from China. This decision is highly controversial, not only because of its far-reaching impact on the global economy, but also because it directly affects the relationships between economic superpowers. However, the big question remains: will the 27 EU countries actually follow through with the US request and impose a 100% tariff on China? While this request comes with a clear strategy to pressure China, the difficulties in enforcement are inevitable. EU countries, particularly those with strong trade ties to China such as Germany, France, and Italy, may not agree with imposing such a high tariff. This divide could create a significant barrier to carrying out the US request, especially as these countries would face serious economic consequences, including higher production costs and reduced export profits. Moreover, Eastern European countries, which rely heavily on supply chains from China, would also face challenges in replacing their Chinese supply sources. Therefore, despite the potential influence of the US request, the actual implementation of a 100% tariff on China by EU nations remains a big question mark. Imposing a 100% tariff on Chinese goods would not only increase consumer costs in the US, but also affect industries that depend on Chinese supplies, such as technology, automobiles, and consumer goods. US consumers would have to pay more for imported products, which could reduce purchasing power and affect the quality of life. However, the more critical question is, what will be the strategic impact on China? Can this tariff actually make China change its trade policies and come to the negotiating table with the US? Or will it simply be a temporary measure that heightens tensions without achieving long-term results? America's dependence on Chinese goods and China's ability to find alternative markets will largely determine the success of this strategy. To stay updated on the latest news and insights on global economic trends, trade strategies, and other hot topics, make sure to subscribe to our channel and follow our upcoming videos. We'll continue to provide you with in-depth analyses and the most recent updates on global events, ensuring you stay informed about the changes in the world of economics and politics. Join us as we keep exploring these fascinating stories in the videos ahead.